Hi, this is video 4 of a lecture series on markets on chapter 3. In this particular video, what we cover is the notion of what an equilibrium is. And in essence, as we see on the whiteboard, what we are going to do is use the environment of the market. And this environment is a two-dimensional environment where the price of a commodity is measured in the vertical axis and the quantity is measured in the horizontal axis, and where the demand curve will interact with the supply curve. By the law of demand, opportunity costs dictate that more quantity is demanded at lower prices, and the opposite is true by the law of supply. And we say that a market is found to be in equilibrium whenever we find the price and quantity that consumers and producers alike agree upon, yielding for us an equilibrium amount of units sold in the marketplace. So the intersection point where supply and demand meet gives rise to what we call the equilibrium quantity, the Q with a star on it, and the equilibrium price, P also with a star stamp. So that is what we, that intersection where supply and demand agree, both in price and in units, is what we call the equilibrium in the market. And it is a state contingent description of a reality. It is not where markets are all of the time necessarily. There are instances in which a market may be in a situation where the price is too high relative to what the market bears. In this kind of a situation, when the price is too high, the quantity demanded is inferior to the quantity supplied in offering by firms in the market. And so what you have is a situation of excess supply. So there are instances in which a market is not in equilibrium, and that would be described by a price that is too high relative to the equilibrium, yielding an excess supply of the good, or a surplus. That's another way of referring to this. A surplus or excess supply. Other situations where you might see a price that is below the equilibrium level of a market can result in situations that we call excess demand for the good, because the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied at such below market equilibrium prices. So we call those situations of deficit or excess demand. When will the market not be in equilibrium? Well, the market might not be in equilibrium when there is a sudden change in any one of the factors that either affect demand or supply, or whenever there is an intervention in the market by either a contract or a constitutional or a governmental issue. So all those are situations that might take a market out of its free market equilibrium, out of the point where consumers and producers within that market agree are situations that are in a where there's agreement between buyers and sellers. Let's look at an example where you have a city with rental markets of apartments. So these are residential units. And you have a market where there's a certain supply for apartments and a certain demand for apartments. So we can call the vertical axis the price or the rent that people pay per unit, and the apartment units would be on the horizontal axis. In this case, the supply of apartments would have a slightly interesting shape. It would be nearly vertical in shape. The reason why it would be nearly vertical is because it's really hard, it's nearly impossible to be able to build apartments overnight. It takes a long time to build apartment buildings and apartment units. It takes years to build such units. So it's very difficult to see more supply or less supply overnight. Most of the short-term supplies happen when rents go up by so much that people are willing to take in strangers to live in their homes, in their in-law units or in their backyard units or even in their own homes. And so that actually could grow the supply of apartments. But it tends to have a very vertical structure to it. On the other hand, we're going to look at a demand curve where the demand curve is going to look more traditional, where higher rents mean people just move to farther away cities, or they move out of apartments and back to their homes with their relatives or parents or guardians and whatnot. And the stamp where you see the star, that would be the equilibrium. The equilibrium then results in a specific rent, which would be the equilibrium level of rents in a city, and a specific amount of units rented. So I'll call that Q for the number of apartments rented. And I'll put a stamp of star next to Q, and I'll put a stamp of star next to R to show a market that may have free characteristics where only the landlords and the tenants are basically exchanging value in this particular market. Now, what happens if you live in a city where you could actually impose what are called rent control limitations? In such cities, what happens is that the government could come in and pass a law that rents cannot exceed a certain level. So we're going to call this a rental ceiling, also known as rent control. So what would happen in the market where rent control forces rents to be below what the market would bear? In that kind of a situation, according to our model, what we would see is a higher demand for rental units than the amount of rental units available in the marketplace. So you would see a gap. You would see a gap between the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied. And that gap would create what's known as a deficit of units. In other words, we're showing in this case that rent control may cause what we would call people not finding apartments to rent, or a housing shortage, a deficit of units, or a shortage of units. If you allow the market to equilibrate without the restriction in place, without rent control, okay, so let me call this green point here RC for rent control, and put a small bar on the bottom to show that it's a ceiling on prices. Then you would have a situation where the government intervention into this market, or the intervention into the property rights of landlords and tenants freely negotiating prices, would result in a shortage of apartment units. It would make it seem as if there aren't enough units that are available to rent. So that's how the supply and demand market structure that we are creating would explain a housing shortage following a binding rent control ceiling on rent prices. And the word binding there is to mean that the rent control is below the necessary, below the market equilibrium. Let's see what happens if the rent control is not below the market equilibrium. So let's go back and look at a model in which you have the price dimension and the quantity dimensions of the marketplace. So price here is rent, quantity here is units rented, and you have, again, supply is nearly vertical because of what we mentioned before, that it's really hard to build units for rent in a very quick time period. So in a short period of time, you would see a very steep supply curve, and the demand curve can be more flexible. And you have the equilibrium price. So you have what's called the market rate of rents, where we see the R with a star. And we have the equilibrium quantity of rental units as the Q with a stamp of a star. What if you pass a law and the law says that the rents that you can charge cannot be higher than the rate shown here in this line? What if this is the rent control limit, the ceiling on rents? So I'm going to call this RC for rent control ceiling. Well, as you can see, the current market rents are obeying the law because they are already below the rental rate. So this market would not be affected at all. This law would not have any impact on the rental market in question. So this law is basically moot. It's as if you put a sign on a freeway that says that you cannot go over 60 miles an hour as your speed limit, and every car is going 40 miles an hour, and nobody has to change their behavior anyway. So that would be a moot law. So this is what happens if you impose a price ceiling that is non-binding. Okay? So this is called non-binding price ceiling. Okay? If you pass a law that says that you cannot rent apartment units for more than $1 million a month, and nobody's paying over $1 million a month in rent in that city, that law is just occupying space. It's not really having any real economic impact on the market's behavior. Consumers don't have to change their behavior. Producers don't have to change their behavior, and thus it's a non-binding rule. So that's the difference between a non-binding rule and a, now, as you can see in this case, a binding rule. Okay. Another very controversial subject besides the subject of rent control that we can use to describe these market units with is the issue of the minimum wage laws. If you have what's called a labor market, you have suppliers of labor and consumers of labor. The suppliers of labor are people who are called workers. And what they supply is workers' time. So I'm going to put here worker hours. They supply hours of their time. for work. And instead of price, we're going to call this vertical axis the wages, the wage per hour in dollars per hour. How much people get paid to do the work. And in this case, the supply curve is going to be what people provide labor for. And it could very well be that people are very willing to supply more and more work hours as long as they get paid more and more per hour. And then companies or businesses are willing to pay wages to workers on a per hour basis, and they will consume as many hours or demand as many hours of work as their wages can cover. So if you provide work for lower dollars per hour wage, they might want to demand more hours of wages. And the equilibrium between the two results in a particular market wage and a particular number of hours worked. So this is the quantity of hours worked. So I'm going to call this labor, L star. And I'm going to call this point here W star for the wages that people are in equilibrium charging in order to work the number of hours that is currently known as arbitrarily as L star. Okay, so notice how the wages and the amount of labor are actually measured in this market setting. Now let's introduce an ordinance. Let's say that there's something called a minimum wage ordinance. It's a law that a local government passes saying that there should be a minimum wage. And in this particular marketplace, you set the price to a price floor. So we're going to call WWF for the wage floor, the lowest possible wage, lowest legally allowed wage. Wage floor. And let's say that the wage floor is binding. So in this case, I would have to build a wage floor that is above the market rate of wages. So I'm going to put WF where I just built that that horizontal line. That's my wage floor. So wages cannot be allowed to be as low as the market is balancing things out. So buyers of labor, companies, and sellers of labor, workers, agree on a wage, but that wage is below what the law dictates or mandates in this particular area. So what is that going to create according to our model? According to our model, what that creates is less demand for hours of labor on the part of businesses, and people are willing to supply even more hours than they would in a market equilibrium. And so what we now have is an excess supply of labor. So we have a lot more people, hours, and excess supply. So obviously what you would see in the market would be what the market bears, which is what what companies are willing to hire for. And so the argument, one of the arguments against minimum wage laws is that if they are binding, they impact the market to suppress the amount of labor hours in that market. And so you end up with less work hours than you would expect to see, less work hours than you would expect to see in equilibrium. So you create unemployment, and you create unemployment among the lowest wage sectors. So that's an example of the utilization of this market tool to explain in part binding minimum wage ordinances and their impact on the market of labor. Just like in the earlier example, we did a binding example of rent control. So those are examples of regulations that would affect or would alter the behavior of people in the so-called marketplace. Okay. So to summarize, an equilibrium is a condition in which the supply and demand functions of the market both find common agreement at a particular price and quantity, which is referred to as the equilibrium price and quantity. And sometimes we are off equilibrium situations that may be caused by either intervention in the market, by not allowing the market to freely arrive at its equilibrium, or because we have disruptions to some of the non-price factors that may impact supply or demand and may affect the supply by shifting it upwards or downwards, in either case for demand and supply. And in that situation, the market would be off equilibrium. A very useful tag to have is this particular slide in your PowerPoints, which shows you what the direction of price and quantity changes are from equilibrium if you decrease or increase supply or demand, as well as what happens if you take into account a pair of shifts in demand and supply, and how sometimes the direction of price change or quantity change is not predictable. I hope this video on the market supply and market demand in equilibrium is a useful complement to the other videos that we have recorded and that are available for your viewing. In your completion of your homework number 3, which is already up, and your quiz number 3, which is about to be posted, and in your discussion board of chapter 3. Thank you for watching.